Hello, everyone. Welcome. We'll be getting started in about a minute. We're just waiting for folks to join in right now. Please keep in mind that this session will be recorded. We're just waiting for more folks to jump in before we get started. Hello, everyone. Just as a reminder, this webinar session is being recorded and we're going to get started very shortly. We're waiting for everyone to join in, but as we do so, I'll be passing it off to Thais for the introductions.
Thank you so much, Andres. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those in the West Coast. Welcome to today's briefing on Refugee Resettlement, Private Sponsorship Program, and Title 42, brought to you by World America and our wonderful partners. Remember, this is a quarterly webinar, and we're excited to, bring you all the content and all the information that you need as we navigate this really interesting atmosphere of policy and programs related to the immigrant and the refugee communities. I want to invite everyone to introduce themselves in the chat, perhaps put your name, organization, and where are you based. My name is Thais Carrero, and I am the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the National Partnership for New Americans. And like I said, today we'll have the latest updates on the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program, learn about the recently launched Refugee Private Sponsorship Program, the Welcome Course, and hear about the current status of Title 42. Our guests will share ways you and your organization can be involved and how can you take action to support these programs and individuals seeking refuge. Our guests today are Danilo Zak, Associate Director of Policy and Advocacy at Church World Service, Deb Stein, Senior Liaison for Strategic Partnerships at Community Sponsorship Hub, and Kimiko Hirota, Policy Advisor for the Women's Refugee Commission Migrant Rights and Justice Programs. I want to begin by saying that the timing of this briefing cannot be better. We're coming out of a very hard week with the announcement of the Asylum Ban and the continuation of a series of congressional hearings that are aimed to undermine our communities and the work that we're doing. However, we know that this is also the moment when our communities become stronger as we use the circumstances to fuel to keep our work going, because we know that the work we do every day is what will ultimately increase the pressure on the government, whichever administration that is, to fix the broken system that we've been trying to decipher for decades. We welcome every effort that will improve the system, but we absolutely reject the continuous use of policies that have failed in the past as a trade-off and as the framing for immigrant and refugee conversations. Today's webinar is a chance to learn more about the opportunities that we have right now to help our brothers and sisters seeking safety. A little bit of housekeeping. We're going to be hosting today's webinar in webinar format. As you can see, you can interact with our guests in their presentations using the chat and the Q&A feature. We'll be monitoring both of them. Guests may answer your question as it is asked if they're able to see it, but we have a lot of time for questions at the end of all the presentations. So with all that said, I'm going to turn it over to our first guest, Danilo Zak, Associate Director of Policy and Advocacy at Church World Service, who will be giving us an overview of the Refugee Resettlement Program.
Thank you so much, Thais, and really appreciate you having me on to talk a little bit about the Refugee Resettlement Program. I will try to provide a brief overview of sort of the state of play when it comes to refugee resettlement, update on sort of the current data and stats that we're seeing recently in terms of refugees resettled, some of the trends we're seeing in general when it comes to resettlement and the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, touch on some key challenges, which there are many, and also some signs of progress, which we have seen, and then really also get into some of the actions we're asking the public to take and highlighting an opportunity as well for some folks to come to the Hill and share perspectives with the new Congress, the 118th Congress, that certainly needs to hear more about ways to uphold the refugee admissions program and support refugees in their districts. So Really excited to provide that brief overview, and we can go to the next slide. So just super quickly, some of the major trends when it comes to refugee resettlement. Of course, President Biden sets the refugee admissions goal or ceiling each year, and we work on fiscal years. So that means starting in October. And so we're currently in the midst of fiscal year 2023, and President Biden set the admission ceiling to 125,000, which is the same as he did last year. And so that, again, goes from October 2022 to September 2023. So we're already over a third of the way into the fiscal year. And that means we know about some of the progress that's been made in terms of refugee resettlement. And what we know is that the administration is still clearly struggling to rebuild a program that was decimated by Trump-era restrictions and as well the lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. So just 4 months into the fiscal year, so we have data up until January, and that suggests we're on track to resettle only 27,700 total refugees. So that's less than 30,000 refugees for the whole year. Of course, far, far below the ceiling that was set at 125,000. And I'll get into some of the reasons why. But just to note, the administration has really struggled despite setting these goals, which I think have been reflective of the administration's desire to rebuild the program. In terms of actual refugees resettled, it really has not gotten to that point. And we're resettling right around 2,500 refugees a month, which again, nowhere near the amount that would be needed to meet that ceiling of 125,000, and certainly a concern. But in terms of the countries of origin for resettlement this year, and this has really been the case for much of the Biden administration, we've seen the most refugees coming from Democratic Republic of the Congo, and then Burma, folks fleeing the context there. Increasing number of Afghan refugees, although we have seen, it's been really slow for the administration to process many Afghans who have fled after the fall of Kabul last year. And then also an increasing number of Syrian refugees. They're the fourth most resettled so far. That has been a real change since the Trump administration, when the Trump administration really emphasized refugee resettlement from non-Muslim countries, unfortunately. And it's been good to see the increase in refugees arriving from places like Syria, where there is still a lot of need. And that's been sort of a feature of the Biden administration in terms of refugee resettlement. And then we see Ukraine and Guatemala, also large numbers of refugees resettled, or I should say relatively large, still far lower than what we'd like to see. And the administration has made an emphasis on resettling folks from the Western Hemisphere. And so you see Guatemala there. They pledged to resettle 20,000 refugees from the hemisphere over the next 2 years. We're not on track to meet that. In fact, we're well below that as well, but will be interesting to see moving forward as the administration continues to prioritize resettlement from the Western Hemisphere in places in South America and Central America. And I will say, there is an expectation that monthly arrivals will increase the second half of this fiscal year, where, we're seeing some positive signs, which I'm going to get into, but the state of play right now is really one where it's still a very decimated resettlement program that needs a lot of support to get back on its feet. And instead, to respond to some of the recent sort of emerging forced migration situations and crises, including in Ukraine and in Afghanistan over the last couple of years, we've seen the administration really rely on these more agile, more rapid, but very temporary humanitarian parole programs to respond, rather than the U.S. refugee admissions program. So when Afghans were evacuated out of Afghanistan, we used parole for over 70,000 of them, which provides temporary protection to the U.S., but not permanent protections like refugee status does. And again, over 70,000 folks have been paroled in from Afghanistan. And then during the war in Ukraine, we've resettled now over 100,000 Ukrainians, also via a temporary humanitarian parole process, which again does not provide the same benefits, at least initially. We provided some similar benefits via a congressional act, but certainly does not provide the same path to permanent status that refugee resettlement does. And so it's been a concern to see the administration, instead of trying to rebuild and grow and expand and create more agile refugee admissions processes, instead rely on some of these more temporary humanitarian parole programs, which have still been very helpful and laudable, but it's important to also focus and prioritize on rebuilding our refugee admissions program, which does offer that permanent protection. So moving on to the next slide. So this provides just a little bit of sort of a snapshot into how the resettlement system is doing, right? We see sort of the Obama years on the left, where we were consistently resettling around 70,000 refugees a year, and we're growing to even more than that. If you rewind all the way to the 80s and 90s, you'd see many years with over 100,000 refugees resettled. That was quite common during that era. And then unfortunately, of course, you can also see during the Trump administration, right around 2017, how precipitously the refugee program was slashed, and that happened in a number of different areas. And then in 2020, with the pandemic, it fell to very, very low. And that's been sort of the context that the Biden administration is trying to recover and rebuild from. Although you can see we're only making moderate progress, right? We're still only below 30,000 refugees a year resettled. It's far below where the program has been historically, and there is a lot of work to do to ensure that the administration is really prioritizing and effectively succeeding at rebuilding our refugee admissions program and ensuring we can welcome more refugees into the country. Next slide. And then this is just another chart that provides some sort of insight or context for where we are right now. So again, we've currently resettled 9,240 refugees so far this fiscal year. So that's the first 4 months, October, November, December, and January. And that puts us on track for less than 30,000 for the whole year. We need to be resettling over 10,000 refugees a month to reach our goal of 125,000. And we are not close to that, which has been very concerning to see continued. And so again, just this chart should serve as a way of explaining how far we have to go to really build up our program, despite the admissions goal being set at 125,000 both of the last 2 years. Next slide. So I wanted to get into why we're struggling so much. I think this is something that people have asked. We've set the admission ceiling at a high point, or at least at an admirable point, 125,000. Why are we struggling to actually meet that number? And one of the things you might have noticed from the Obama era and years before that is that when we set an admissions goal, we often resettled that number of refugees. There were many years where we resettled almost exactly the number that was listed in the admissions goal. That's no longer the case. The Biden administration has set this goal for 125,000 and fallen far, far short in its years so far. One of the big reasons is funding, and is just providing the resources necessary for the domestic resettlement agencies to build up capacity. During the Trump administration, over a third of resettlement offices around the country had to close their doors because they weren't getting the resources they needed. They weren't resettling the refugees. The number of refugees required to sort of keep their doors open. And so that's been a big concern. And really throughout the entire resettlement infrastructure, there have been a number of slashes during the Trump administration. COVID slowed things down, and resources is a really big issue to help these agencies build up. And I'll note we've seen some progress. I'll note in the next slide, but more resources is certainly required. And I'll get into how we can push for Congress to provide more resources in a second. But certainly that's one of the key challenges. And there actually has been some resource provision from Congress to sort of help the resettlement agencies respond to this increasing number of Afghan parolees and Ukrainian parolees from entering, also increasing Cuban and Haitian entrants at the border, who resettlement agencies also support. But a lot of that funding is, specifically, or was sort of earmarked specifically for evacuated Afghans, for example, and is not funding that can be used more broadly for the rebuild of the refugee admissions program. So there needs to be more resources this year. We need to encourage Congress to sort of support these agencies and encourage the administration to prioritize, again, the rebuild of the refugee admissions program. And another problem that has long been a serious issue with the U.S. refugee admissions program is just the backlog, and especially the backlog that's due to the security vetting infrastructure that has increased since the 2001 terrorist attacks, and has really grown exponentially during the Trump administration as well, and has really slowed down the admissions process. It can take years for people to go through the refugee admissions process from sort of entering the pipeline to actually being resettled. And you have to remember that these are people who are considered, a lot of the people being referred to our pipeline are those who are most vulnerable, those who are in contexts where they are extremely vulnerable. And it's taking us years to get them from entering the pipeline to actually being resettled into a safer environment in the US. And that's a serious, serious problem. And the sort of discoordinated security vetting infrastructure is a key source of those backlogs and delays. Of course, family reunification is a big issue as well for many resettled refugees in the US who want to apply to have their family members come to the US as well. That process has been extremely complicated and difficult and delayed. It takes years and years still, and is something that the administration needs to prioritize. And then it's also difficult for many to even gain access to the pipeline in the first place. So of course, there's a challenge that it takes so long, but there's also a real challenge for many who meet the definition of a refugee, are fleeing persecution, but can't even access the pipeline. And so we need better processing and infrastructure overseas. We need more avenues for people to enter the pipeline to really ensure a more robust resettlement program. And one, broader overarching problem that I've mentioned already is just the administration needs to make the U.S. refugee admissions program a priority. These parole programs are helpful and they are getting people to safety, but we need to find a way to prioritize U.S. RAP, which again is really one of the clear avenues to allow people permanent protections here in the U.S. And remains so decimated from the Trump administration and COVID-19. Next slide. So I did want to touch on some signs of progress. I mentioned all those problems which continue, but we have been seeing some progress over the last couple of years with the Biden administration. We've seen domestic capacity certainly begin to recover. That was one of the big issues right when Biden took office. There was a lot of concern, like I said, about the offices that had been closed domestically, and just there weren't enough, there wasn't enough capacity domestically to resettle so many people. And that has begun to improve. So we saw over the past year, over 70 new resettlement offices open their doors. And then because refugee resettlement agencies were assisting in the resettlement of many of these Afghans and Ukrainians who were coming in under parole, not refugee status, but they were offered refugee benefits, and many of them were helped to be resettled by refugee agencies. Over 105,000 people were actually sort of supported in their resettlement in the last fiscal year. So what that tells us is that we are getting to a point where domestically, with the proper resources, we can come close to that 125,000 number. And that means that we need to be focusing not just on the domestic side, but also internationally, the entire infrastructure, the pipeline that refugees are waiting in, and the backlog that they're forced to wait in. So that's really a critical part of the story. And so thinking about that pipeline and that backlog, we've also increased the pace of circuit rides and refugee interviews, which really declined dramatically under the Trump administration, and are critical steps to help those waiting in the backlog move forward with their cases. And so we've increased those circuit rides and refugee interviews. I think we could even further, as I'll touch on, but we have dramatically increased them over the last couple of years, up to 44,000 in fiscal year 2022, which is the most since the early years of the Trump administration. But there is a long way to go on that front. And then I think I am not the one to discuss at length the new Welcome Corps initiative, but there have been some new and innovative efforts to sort of supplement and bolster the refugee resettlement program. And the Welcome Corps initiative really is one of those, not just in the first phase of resettling up to 5,000 refugees, but in future phases where folks may be able to help refer people to the pipeline as well. There's a lot of interesting and innovative new approaches being considered by the administration that I think is really positive. All right, next slide. Just quickly, I mentioned on the refugee interview front, again, this is happening overseas with refugees who are often in first countries of asylum in vulnerable contexts, waiting for their cases to move forward, and they need to have this refugee interview. We can see it was basically no interviews happened in 2020, and they have been increasing pretty dramatically the last couple of years with the sort of investment of the Biden administration, but we're not close to that historical average of 65,000 a year. I would say we need to go higher than that. to really have a robust refugee resettlement system. And so there is still, like with many aspects of the program, a lot of work to do and a lot of space for us to be pushing the administration and for Congress to increase the number of refugee interviews, rebuild that pipeline, and get it moving quickly such that people can actually be resettled into safety and not have to wait for years in camps while their cases proceed. Next slide. So wanted to touch on some of these priorities. They shouldn't be too big a surprise based on what I've just been talking about, but we're really pushing for Congress to do three broad things. The first is hold the administration, the Biden administration, accountable for rebuilding the resettlement program. Congress has an oversight function. It's not just about passing laws. It's also about ensuring the administration is doing what it should be. And one of those areas of oversight really must be to ensure oversight over the administration's administering of the refugee resettlement program and make sure that as many refugees are resettled this year as possible. And then the next big thing, as I mentioned, is resources and funding. It can get kind of technical and wonky, but a robust refugee resettlement system requires funding from Congress. Congress sets the budget each year for the administrative agencies that are responsible for refugee resettlement, from the State Department to the Office of Refugee Resettlement within the Health and Human Services. And all these accounts really need to ensure robust funding for the program in order to rebuild capacity within the program, and also to ensure that refugees who have already arrived are receiving the benefits they need to thrive. And then finally, this is, I think, more in line with what most people expect from Congress, although it's not something they do very often, is really working on legislation and passing legislation that would support refugees around the world and those who have already been resettled as well. The Refugee Protection Act is one that's been introduced in past years that would really robustly protect and expand and ensure a healthy refugee resettlement system that hasn't been reintroduced yet, but we're hoping it does. And when it does, we're hoping it has as many co-sponsors as possible, as much support as possible. And there are other pieces of legislation as well that would help improve the resettlement and asylum processes that we'll be supporting in the coming year. And we're urging members of Congress to support as well. Next slide. And I do want to touch quickly on an opportunity where it's not just about sending an email to Congress, but sometimes there's also opportunities to go and have meetings with your members of Congress and their staff. And in this case, RCUSA, in partnership with CIWIS and many other organizations, are holding in-person advocacy days in Washington, D.C. in early May, so May 2nd and 3rd. And I encourage you all to sort of hold the date, save the date. I think there's a lot more information that will be coming shortly about those advocacy days, but it's an opportunity to come to DC, meet with your members of Congress and their staff, share your perspective, your personal perspective on the importance of welcoming refugees. It's really, this kind of advocacy is not about being an expert in the issue. It's about sharing your perspective with your member of Congress. And there also will be some training opportunities before the meetings, especially, special leadership training opportunities for refugee and asylee participants, which I think we're really hoping we get robust participation from those who have experienced forced migration themselves and are able to sort of share their stories and eager to share their stories. So it should be a great opportunity to push this advocacy forward. And again, will be happening on May 2nd and 3rd. So please save the date and look out for more information from We Are All America and others. Last slide, I think there's one more. And then, for those, before the advocacy days, we've also developed sort of an action alert where folks can really easily message their members of Congress, whether it's an email or a tweet on social media, and urge them to really push forward some of the priorities that I mentioned in terms of supporting the refugee resettlement system. So you can use that link. I hope we can share it out later as well. But it's one way to quickly and easily make sure your voice is heard with your members of Congress. And I think that is everything, but happy to answer questions as well as they come up at the end of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Danilo. Just FYI, we've had a couple questions come in through the Q&A feature. If you want to answer them there, that's good. We can also discuss at the end. Thank you so much. Certainly excited to see more individuals being able to take advantage of the program, the slight progress that has happened in different areas, but also recognizing the need, right, to continue building infrastructure and pathways for permanent relief. So now I'm gonna turn it over to Deb Stein, Senior Liaison for Strategic Partnerships for the Community Sponsorship Hub, who will be talking about the Welcome Course, a new refugee private sponsorship program launched in January. Reminder, you can put your questions in the Q&A feature. Deb, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. I'm very excited to be with you all today to talk about the Welcome Corps. But first, let me take a quick step back to speak a little bit about the Community Sponsorship Hub. We were launched in September of 2021 with the mission to grow the role of communities in the protection, resettlement, and integration of refugees and other forcibly displaced people by mobilizing civil society and the public, private, and philanthropic sectors, and empowering them with resources to welcome refugees to their communities through community sponsorship. Next slide, please. So the Welcome Corps, as noted, was launched in January of 2023. Very exciting. CSH's role, first of all, in the Welcome Corps is to support a consortium in the successful launch and implementation of this private sponsorship program. So briefly, the Welcome Corps is a program of the U.S. Department of State administered by a consortium that's led by the Community Sponsorship Hub and with funding provided by the U.S. government. Through the Welcome Corps, more Americans will be able to welcome refugees seeking freedom and safety, and in turn, be able to make a difference in their own communities. Next slide, please. So as noted, this is a public-private partnership, and it is implemented through a consortium of organizations, each of whom have an expertise in a particular area of refugee resettlement. Many of these organizations, I think folks on this call will be very familiar with, including our colleagues at CWS that we just heard from. And so I'll start with them, but CWS, through their Refugee Welcome Collective, will build the capacity of private sponsor groups and helping to train potential private sponsors. IRAP, International Refugee Assistance Program, will be responsible for providing pro bono application support to prospective private sponsors. Colleagues at IRC will be responsible for the processing piece of private sponsorship. So their expertise will be leveraged to match, place, and assure cases. IRIS, which is Integrated Refugee and Immigration Services, is Connecticut's largest immigrant serving agency, and they've developed the nation's largest co-sponsorship program. Their expertise will be leveraged to provide application support focused on the development of welcome plans and budgets with private sponsor groups. And finally, Welcome.us, which is a national initiative that's mobilized tens of thousands of Americans already to welcome newcomers, will be leading in the implementation of mobilization strategies to support the Welcome Corps. Next slide, please. So let's talk for a moment about the sort of heart and soul of the Welcome Corps, which are private sponsored groups. As you'll see, eligibility to form a private sponsor group is comprised of at least 5 adults, all of whom need to live in the same community, who commit to raising $2,375 per newcomer and commit to 90 days of support in providing core private sponsorship services. And some of this may look familiar to you, as it is modeled very closely on the RNP program, and that is very intentional on PRM's part in order to maintain parity. Private sponsor groups will be screened by trained staff at the Community Sponsorship Hub, and that will include confirmation of cleared background checks. There will be comprehensive training before any private sponsor group is matched with a refugee. And that's evidenced through their completion of a welcome plan and demonstrated evidence of the required funds being raised. Private sponsor groups will also sign code of conduct in addition to the background checks as part of our safeguarding effort. And again, as I noted, the welcome plan, which is a critical piece of the Welcome Corps application, and it essentially outlines how private sponsor groups will welcome refugees, including through housing, essential furnishings, and connection to community services. Next slide, please. Private sponsor groups will receive quite a bit of support, both before they even start the application process, and then through their onboarding, and before they're even matched with refugees, and then throughout the sponsorship period, as you can see by the support listed here on the slide. Next slide, please. Okay, let me just also note, sorry, got a bit ahead of myself on the slides here. I do want to note that privately sponsored refugees are eligible for all the same mainstream and ORR funded benefits and services as refugees that are resettled through the RNP program. And that includes extended services, such as those that might be offered through local resettlement agencies. The coordination of that is still being worked out with resettlement stakeholders, including state refugee coordinators and state refugee health coordinators, ORR and PRM, and resettlement agencies. Privately sponsored refugees will be connected to ongoing benefits and services at the conclusion of their 90-day sponsorship period. And it's important to note that, of course, we know that it takes much longer than 90 days to welcome refugees, but this is the minimum requirement that sponsor groups are asked to commit to. So in their welcome plan, these private sponsor groups will be required to detail all of their plans for supporting the refugees' transition following the 90-day sponsorship period. And they will be supported in all of their work by private sponsor organizations whose responsibility it is to prepare these groups to receive and be matched with refugees and help them as they guide refugee newcomers to access available benefits and services. There are many ways that folks who are on the call here, that through your organizations, that you can engage in the Welcome Corps. One is by being a private sponsor organization, and another is through serving as a recruitment organization. And I'll talk a little bit more about those on the next slide. So private sponsor organizations then need to be 501c3 status, and they agree to support and oversee a minimum of 50 private sponsorship groups. All private sponsor organizations will need to complete the same required training that private sponsor groups do. And in order to apply to become a private sponsor organization, they'll need to submit an application to the Community Sponsorship Hub that demonstrates the financial health of the organization and their organizational capacity to serve as a PSO. And then organizations that successfully apply will be invited to sign a memorandum of understanding, and they will then be invited to complete a series of onboarding and training. So essentially the role of PSOs is to provide oversight and support to private sponsor groups throughout the sponsorship process. And this is really an opportunity for organizations that have significant experience in working with refugees to leverage that expertise and their other assets in supporting private sponsor groups to successfully sponsor privately sponsored refugees. Another way that organizations can engage in the Welcome Corps is as a recruiting organization. Next slide, please. So any organization can actually become a recruitment organization. The requirements for that are just that you have the desire to engage with the program. But by being a recruitment organization, you have the opportunity to leverage your networks in supporting the Welcome Corps. Organizations are not limited by their size, their location, or their past experience. Much like the Welcome Corps is seeking to engage everyday Americans throughout the country to serve as private sponsor groups, we want to equip organizations like yours to share this opportunity within your networks and communities. And recruitment organizations essentially serve to raise awareness of the program, to help mobilize support, and help to tell the story of private sponsor groups and the refugees who are being welcomed in new communities. Next slide, please. One of the great benefits of engaging in the Welcome Corps, either as a private sponsor organization or as a recruitment organization, is that this is a great way to be engaged in what we think is the boldest innovation in refugee resettlement in 40 years. And it's in a way that's genuine to and furthers your organizational mission. Next slide, please. So for more information about how you can become engaged with Welcome Corps, I ask you to contact us at the email address listed here. You can also reach us at our website, welcomecorps.org, where you'll find lots more information on the more specifics of the program, as well as next steps. And I'll be happy to answer some questions. I apologize, I haven't been able to see the questions in the chat as I've been presenting, but happy to provide some follow-up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deb. We have been tracking the questions. Some have been posted in the chat, some in the Q&A. You can go ahead and tackle those in the Q&A if you'd like to, but we certainly have, again, space at the end. Thank you so much for your insight and that information on the Welcome Course. This is absolutely an opportunity for our communities and folks who may not have done this before, right? To continue helping to build a welcoming nation where everybody has a level playing field. So really exciting to see this in between, right? And amongst all the challenges that we have. So thank you for that. I'm going to turn it over to Kimiko Hirota, Policy Advisor at the Women's Refugee Commission, to give us an update on Title 42 and where it stands today and moving forward. The floor is yours, Kimiko.
Thank you, Thais, and hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this call and this webinar. There's so much to cover related to Title 42, but also far beyond. As you probably saw, just last week, there was a new asylum ban announced by the Biden administration. So tons to tackle. So thank you for joining. And feel free to switch to the next slide. Okay, so I'll start off first with just an overview of where Title 42 is at. As you all probably know, Title 42 is a public health law that was initially weaponized by the Trump administration as a way to keep asylum seekers from being able to seek asylum in the US. And this public health law, unfortunately, has continued to be used up until this day. And so instead of asylum seekers being able to pursue their legal claims in the US, people are forced back to Mexico or even flown on planes back to the countries that they fled from. And even though in April last year, the CDC did say Title 42 was no longer necessary to prevent the spread of COVID-19, litigation has kept the policy in place. So it continues to this day. And although the Supreme Court has decided to drop its case about Title 42 just earlier this month from its calendar, it's still expected to stay in place until May 11th. And that is the date that the Biden administration has said it would end the public health declaration. That is one of the reasons Title 42 is still in place. So we're anticipating it is a part of our world in asylum up until then. I would also think it's important to add that even though President Biden pretty recently had stated he does not like Title 42, his administration did decide to expand its use to expel more people using Title 42. So people from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela are now all also expelled back to Mexico if they try to seek asylum in the US. So it's definitely a concerning development that we were really disappointed to see recently. Next slide, please. So in terms of the impact on the ground, as I mentioned, because this policy is in place, most people are not able to seek protection in the US. A new, very recent development is that DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, has implemented an app on people's cell phones called CPP-1. And this is a way for people to try to access the asylum system via appointments. And these appointments are coming out every day in pretty small batches. And so unfortunately, the appointments do not match the demand and the number of people who are desperate to seek safety in the US. These appointments are to allow vulnerable people, so like people who don't have shelter, people who are persecuted and are struggling and are trying to get an exception to Title 42 to apply for asylum in the US. So it's a very limited exception process. And because it's a mobile app, it's pretty inaccessible to many people, including those who do not have phones, people who are illiterate or do not read in English, Spanish, Haitian Creole, or French, which are the languages that the app is currently available in, people who lack Wi-Fi. And there are unfortunately many people who are waiting in Mexico trying to access these apps, but are not even in a shelter. And so they're on the streets and are exposed to harm and are really struggling to try to access this very limited exception process and seek asylum in the US. Next slide, please. And so just last week, as I mentioned at the top, there was a very disappointing development. The Biden administration had announced its plans to implement a new asylum ban. This is a rule that's expected to be finalized in May. So before Title 42 is lifted, or right around when Title 42 is no longer in play, here comes this new ban to try to prevent people from being able to access asylum. So this ban would prevent people from being able to be eligible for the asylum process in the US if they do not use the CBP-1 app or first try to apply for other protections in a country that they traveled through, like Mexico. And unfortunately, many asylum seekers, when they're waiting and are trying to get into the US, they're targeted in Mexico for extortion, kidnapping, other violence while they're waiting. And these horrific acts of violence have been recorded by human rights experts, including Human Rights First, more than 10,000 times since the Biden administration took office. So it's a real serious concern. And to state very plainly, seeking asylum is legal. So no matter how somebody arrives to the US, no matter their nationality, their race, their religion, everyone has the right to walk up to a port of entry or to a Border Patrol official and say, I would like to request asylum. So it's really tragic that for almost 3 years now, people have not been able to fairly and accessibly exercise that right to try to seek protection in the US. Next slide, please. So as a real strong pushback is needed, especially now, there are many ways that all of you on this call can take action. One of them is to make it clear to the Biden administration that this asylum ban is something that we strongly oppose and do not want to see implemented. So partners at the American Immigration Council, Welcome with Dignity campaign, and many other organizations have banded together to put together this website, noasylumban.us. And it's a way for everyone to write their own individual unique comment opposing the asylum ban. And this mechanism of advocacy is super important because the US government is required to review all unique comments when they are proposing new regulations and have to both review them and respond to them. So to our concerns and to our recommendations. So it's really important. If everyone on this call, all 100 of us could write our own unique comment opposing the ban, that would make a huge difference. I also would encourage you to sign the Welcome with Dignity pledge. It's at welcomewithdignity.org/take-action. This pledge makes it clear that there's a groundswell of people across the country who support our asylum system and want to see it be restored. It's also a great website to refer to for further actions, protests, and more coming up down the line. I also would encourage you to call your member of Congress. The number that I provided on this slide is the Congressional Switchboard, and they can refer you to your 2 senators or to your member of Congress, and make sure that they know constituents in their district or in their state support the right to seek asylum and are urging them to oppose the asylum ban and other policies that are blocking access to asylum. And then finally, I wanted to flag that in late March next month, it will be the shameful 3rd anniversary of Title 42 being in place. So there are going to be rallies and protests and calls for the right to seek asylum to be restored in DC, along the border and across the country. So be on the lookout for those rallies coming up in the future. And next slide. I think it's just for our Q&A section. So I went over a lot very briefly, but wanted to make sure we had enough time for all the questions. And so thank you so much again for hosting this, and back to you, Thais.
Thank you so much, Kimiko, for that update. Plenty of opportunities to oppose this new asylum ban. So we encourage everybody to, participate in some way. I'm going to start with, and thank you to folks who have been answering some of these questions while we have been seeing the presentations. I'm going to go over these as they have been received. I think, the first one here goes to Deb, and there's multiple questions on this. I'm considering coordinating a private sponsor group in my community. Can you please explain how prospective refugees will be supported after the 90-day period? And then combining with another one, who's going to provide support? Will this fall on the state refugee coordinators?
Thank you for the question. I'll start with the last one first. It will not fall on state refugee coordinators per se, but state refugee coordinators are working with the Community Sponsorship Hub and consortium partners, as well as ORR and PRM and resettlement agencies, to ensure that there's good coordination about referring privately sponsored refugees to services post 90 days. You can learn more about how that will all work by visiting welcomecorps.org. There are several FAQs that are already up on the website, which will answer a lot of the questions that I know that folks have and that have put into the chat. I've been trying to answer a few of them as I could, but there's more information that can be found there as well.
Awesome.
And I'm sorry, could you repeat the first question?
Yeah, absolutely. Can you please explain how prospective refugees will be supported after the 90-day period?
Yeah, so as we've seen, it may be helpful to know that prior to the launch of the Welcome Corps, Community Sponsorship Hub also implemented the Sponsor Circle program for Afghans, and then was able to utilize that format for other sponsors who were seeking additional assistance in assisting Ukrainians who arrived through the Uniting for Ukraine program. And so what we have seen through our experience is that the sponsoring groups provide ongoing support for much longer than the 90-day period. But aside from that, again, privately sponsored refugees are eligible for all the same benefits and services as refugees resettled through the R&P program. So that means they are also eligible for any ongoing services for longer term support. And again, they'll be eligible for those through, most likely through either a combination of resettlement agencies or mainstream community service providers.
Awesome. Thank you, Deb. One more for you.
Mhm.
How will Welcome Course coordinate English language learning for privately sponsored refugees, and which partner organization will assist in the coordination of case management, further accessing benefits?
So every state, just like with regular refugee resettlement through the R&P program, each state has their own programs for whether it's ESL or employment services, what have you. None of those things will change. Privately sponsored refugees will be eligible for all of those same services. Private sponsor groups will have a significant amount of training before they are matched with any refugee newcomers to help them identify where in the community those supports are and how to access them.
Thank you. I got a couple more. What status will Welcome Course provide the refugees?
So refugees resettled through the Welcome Corps also arrive with refugee status, just like they would through the reception and placement program.
This is related to the funding that the group has to demonstrate. They have that the group has to demonstrate they have the funding to, sponsor someone. Does by newcomer mean if there's a family of 4, the group would be responsible for approximately $10,000?
That's correct. So the amount of money that a private sponsor group needs to raise is predicated on the number of people in the family that they're sponsoring.
Awesome. Will funds that sponsors give to refugees count against them as income, making them ineligible for cash assistance?
So that is an excellent question. And one of the reasons why the Welcome Corps was set up to somewhat mirror R&P in the 90-day period and the $2,375 per person is so that they will not be rendered ineligible for certain benefits and services. But I think it's also important to note that most sponsors will be able to provide a significant amount of supports that may make it that the refugees that they're sponsoring may not necessarily need to apply for certain benefits and services. But all of those things will be up to individual private sponsor groups to determine with the families that they're sponsoring. And all of it will also be outlined in their welcome plan before they're even matched with a private sponsor group. And again, those applications for private sponsor groups are vetted by the Community Sponsorship Hub. So there will be plenty of time to be able to determine that the private sponsor group is ready to welcome newcomers, that they are aware of where benefits and services are available in their local community. They will have the support of private sponsor organizations as needed, and as requested, they'll be linked into other stakeholders in the community. So there's a significant amount of support that's available, both to help them in the pre-arrival planning and then ongoing.
Awesome. In the interest of time, I'm going to try to combine some of the questions here that are related to how do the groups of sponsors and refugees are matched. If you could talk a little bit about that. Folks are asking if the sponsors can sponsor refugees in their own communities, and how will the Welcome Course deal with bias against certain refugee populations? Who chooses who gets resettled, right?
Right. So all refugees who will be eligible to be resettled through the Welcome Corps will will be those that have already been identified for resettlement in the USRAP pipeline. So for the first phase of Welcome Corps, those will be matched cases, and they will be matched with those cases that are already in the pipeline through RSC Africa. For phase 2 of the program, which will include naming, and that will be a way that private sponsor groups can apply for a particular refugee that they know of. So, for example, family members, or if somebody wants to apply for a member of their family, they can create a private sponsor group and apply for their relative that way. There's still a bit of time before the naming piece happens. We're not anticipating that will begin before mid 2023. But if you sign up on, if you contact us through the email provided, I think I provided in the chat as well, but it's contact@welcomecorps.org. We can provide more information about how that's going to work. I'm just being mindful of the time that's left. So there's a little more of an explanation to that, but we're happy to share that and much more information afterwards in follow-up with your questions.
Thank you so much, Deb. I got one more and then we're going to wrap it up. And we absolutely appreciate your engagement. This is amazing. I'm not sure that we thought we were going to have so many questions, but we absolutely appreciate it. And after this, we're going to share all the resources with an email so you can continue asking all the questions. One last question regarding refugees coming in as parolees. Does anyone know how they can remain in the US at the end of the 2-year parole period? For instance, we're presently thinking about Ukrainians in U4U may need to apply for TPS. Can anyone take that question?
I can try. I think, it's going to be dependent on the individual context that someone is in. And I think certainly some people are going to have to apply for TPS. And I think I saw at some point someone had raised the Afghan Adjustment Act, which is an effort in Congress to try to allow for those who have arrived under humanitarian parole who are Afghans to access permanent status without needing to go through the asylum process or just continue on sort of temporary status like TPS. And it's important to remember that TPS is also temporary. There may also be an option to apply for re-parole, but that's not yet clear. And that could be a better option for some individuals because it might allow them to stay on the benefits that they're receiving through their parole status, because Congress has provided benefits to Ukrainians and to Afghans who are on parole. So there's a number of possible options. I think TPS and asylum are the most clear ones right now, but it's really difficult to give sort of blanket advice without knowing the specific context.
Absolutely. Thank you, Danilo. We hope we had more time to answer all the questions, but remember that we're here always as a resource, even when we're not, in a digital space together. So thank you everybody for attending. Thank you to our guest speakers for sharing the knowledge and all the materials that you have prepared related to all these programs. We hope that, it was insightful and informative as you and your organizations navigate the programs with their pluses and their deltas and the challenges that we're facing as we continue to work with refugee and immigrant communities in this country. Again, remember that the teams at We're All America, the National Partnership for New Americans, and all our partner organizations are always at your disposal to help in the journey if you decide to, take part in the active implementation of all these policies, or whether that's, advocating for a particular policy. We're always here to find a way for you and your organization to plug in. Resources will be shared via email after today's webinar. Remember, this is a quarterly webinar, so stay tuned for the next one. And last but not least, visit our websites, right? partnershipfornewamericans.org and weareallus.org to connect with us. and learn more about what we're up to. Thanks again, and we hope you have a great rest of the day and an even better week. Thank you all.